Hi everybody, I'm Robin, the Red River historian, and for over 20 years I have been researching, documenting, and sharing the history of the Red River Valley that runs through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana on my website, redriverhistorian.com. I document where the South meets the West, and today we're in a fantastic place, actually one of my favorite places along the Red River Valley, and there are many favorite places, but this is one of my favorite, and it is in Addington, Jefferson County, Oklahoma, inside the Chickasaw Nation.
Addington is a little town named after a postmaster that became an actual settlement when the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad ran its tracks through in the 1890s. The Crip Line was built at the western edge of the Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory. And look what else is around Addington, the Chisholm Trail. Before the Great Depression, Addington had a bank, cotton gins, lumberyard, and a brick plant. It was a fairly busy town. However, a bank robbery in 1928 forced the bank's closure, and the Great Depression exacerbated the town's decline. Today, I consider Addington a ghost town. Although it's still occupied, Addington no longer has a school.
Addington is home to this lovely area called Monument Hill. And it's called Monument Hill because there's a monument on top of it. And the monument is dedicated to the people who drove cattle up what is known as the Chisholm Trail. And this was used as a lookout point for the cattle drivers that went up this trail, as well as a bedding down place. And that is our topic today. We're going to look a little bit at how the cattle got over the Red River and into Indian Territory and came up to this hill.
Before the Civil War, ranchers, cowboys, and vaqueros drove cattle from Mexico and southern Texas to New Orleans, where live cattle were shipped upriver to St. Louis. This was a slow and rather expensive undertaking. So ranchers sought the railroads to do their shipping, but there were no railroads that connected Texas to the north. Thus the cattle were driven to a railhead in Missouri along the Texas Trail, or what is also called the Shawnee Trail, in the mid-19th century. A railhead means that this is as far west as a railway reached. Legend has it that the plan to trail cattle to railheads was hatched at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio. The cattle were taken to Sedalia, Missouri, to be shipped east for processing. This was a very profitable enterprise that expanded after the Civil War. However, more and more people were farming in Missouri and eastern Indian Territory and didn't want Texas longhorns infecting their local stock with ticks that carried Texas fever. Missouri banned Texas cattle. Around 1867, Joseph McCoy, an Anglo cattle handler from Illinois, encouraged cattle drives to forego the old Texas Trail. He set up shop in Abilene, Kansas, and together with the town's founder, Tim Hersey, he enticed the Kansas and Pacific Railway to make its westernmost railhead there. Then, McCoy convinced Texas ranchers to use the network of trails in northern Indian Territory that had already been established by traders like Jesse Chisholm, who was a Cherokee, and Black Beaver, who was from the Delaware tribe. McCoy then linked a surveyed trail to Abilene from the Wichita River in Kansas. This network of trails has been referred to as the Chisholm Trail, perhaps because the trail passed Jesse Chisholm's trading post. The term was immortalized by map makers in the early 20th century who wanted to entice automobile tourism, and also by cattle drovers themselves, remembering the cattle trails when they were being interviewed by the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression. But when the trail was still in use, it was known on maps as the Abilene Cattle Trail. Now Texans had a new route to drive their cattle to market. The cattle, mostly the hybrid Longhorn breed, were driven northward on various beef trails until the drives reached the Red River.
Once the cattle made it to Red River, they often crossed here at Red River Station in Montague County. Red River Station was specifically created for the cattle trails. This is where there were dipping bats in order to kill the tick that created Texas fever that tended to reside on longhorn cattle. This was also where the tax man was in order to generate or get the revenue for the state of Texas. And also there were outfitters right here where the trail drivers could get their lassos, ropes, whatever they needed in order to go up the trail.
The cattle drives generated a lot of money, and not just in selling cattle, but also for people who supplied the drives. This photograph is of an English cowboy right after he spent a lot of money to look snazzy as he went up the cattle trail. According to a cowboy account, the pants alone cost $15. That would be about $400 in today's money. Nearby Red River Station was the larger town of Spanish Fort, where there were, at one point, more saloons than inhabitants. This little town deserves its own video. I'll talk about it soon. The cattle trails entered Indian territory in a landscape in flux. Cows were replacing the bison, which were being purposely slaughtered by Anglo hunters. There were few trees except in the stands of the cross timbers. The sage and buffalo grasses, once 4 to 5 feet high, were being replaced by non-native grasses with shallow root systems.
When the cattle trails got into Indian territory, they often stopped at a bison hide trading post named Fleetwood. It was manned by the family named Fleetwood of the Chickasaw Nation. Fleetwood later on became a real community with a school, a church, cotton gin, all that good stuff. But back when the cattle drives came through, it was mainly a place to buy supplies and to maybe get some mail or things like that. Now the Fleetwood family moved a little bit further east of the trail and settled right here, and that is the family cemetery, just maybe a half-mile east of the trail here in Jefferson County. From what I know, this is the probable location of the Fleetwood trading post. Now, this brick building is not the original building, of course, but this was most likely where the cattle trails tended to go to in order to get supplies and so forth from the Fleetwood family. Back when Monument Hill was actually being used by the cowboys, this was called Lookout Hill. They used this hill to bed down the cattle so they could see far and wide and see where the cattle were. They could look out for coyotes and things like that, but they could also be on the lookout for danger. Danger from weather, as well as danger from other people, such as cattle rustlers, or Native American tribesmen.
In 1866, the treaty that the Chickasaw Nation was forced to accept by Congress made the Chickasaws lose their lands west of the 98th meridian. Beyond the 98th meridian, a demarcation line which now parallels US 81, were the newly created reservations for the Southern Plains people like the Comanches, Kiowas, and Apaches. The tribes were not ranchers like the Chickasaws. Instead, they were hunters. Sometimes the Plains tribes hunted the cattle being driven up the trail or took horses, especially after the Anglo-Americans staged the mass bison slaughters. They also saw the cattle drivers as trespassers and would demand a beeve as a toll payment. The real trouble began when Anglo drivers did not comply with the demand for toll. They started fights with the native men, often violent ones. Considering that the drivers were reimbursed by the tribes through the Bureau of Indian Affairs whenever they paid tolls or their horses were raided, their refusal to comply for toll payments masked Anglo hostility and disdain towards the Plain Indians.
And that was one of those big myths of the cattle trails, that it was dangerous and that there was a lot of Indian trouble, as some of the cowboys mentioned. And a lot of the Indian trouble was actually generated by the cowboys themselves.
The Chickasaw Nation also demanded tolls from the drivers, which the cowboys tended to pay without too much grousing. After all, the Chickasaws were also ranchers who bought the cattle along the trail to supply their own ranches.
Monument Hill is also a gravesite. It's a gravesite for Tom Lattimore, an African-American cattle driver who wanted to be buried up on Lookout Hill upon his death. He died in 1944, and his gravesite's right here now on Monument Hill.
If you'd like to learn more about the cattle trails, please check out my books. You can retrace the 3 main south to north cattle trails in Traveling History Up the Cattle Trails, and visit ghost towns along the Red River in Traveling History Amongst the Ghosts. You can buy them on my website, redriverhistorian.com, or on Amazon.
Thank you so much for visiting with me today. I'm Robin, the Red River Historian, and for over 20 years I have been documenting great places like this, like Addington, Oklahoma, out at Lookout Hill, or as this place calls it, Lookout Point, in Jefferson County in the Chickasaw Nation. And I hope to show more of the Red River Valley with you through my website, also through YouTube, so make sure you subscribe to this channel. So thank you so much for visiting, and I hope to see you soon.